Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Right off the bat, I hope that you guys will excuse my voice today. I haven't even really been sick, but I've just been having an irritated sore throat, so I'm not sure how much the scratchiness in my voice is going to carry over in this video, but I figured we'll just address that right at the beginning of the video. I hope you will bear with me on this little tour of my tomato garden today. So today I wanted to share with you guys basically an update on how my tomato plants are doing. You know, I talk a lot about tomato plants. At the beginning of the season, I spend a lot of time deciding exactly which tomato varieties to grow. And then, I put so much effort into growing the plants and maintaining them. As the season goes on, I get a little busy and, put a little bit less effort into them. They're more kind of, at this point in the season, they're really on their own. I come out there to harvest, and honestly, whatever they can do beyond that to support their health is kind of up to them. So, I will say, when I decided to film this video, there was a little bit of, uncertainty. Should I come out and tidy up my garden? Should I clip away all the diseased parts? Should I not harvest for a couple days so it looks like I have a huge tomato crop? There's a little bit of temptation to do that when you are making a video and putting it out there for the world. But as I thought about it, I'm like, I don't think that's actually presenting an unrealistic view of how my garden is. I don't think is really going to be that helpful for you guys. I think that showing my garden with all of its flaws, and believe me, there are plenty of flaws, especially this time of year in the tomato garden. I think that just seeing how the tomatoes grow, realistically, I don't have a huge garden. I don't have tons of time to devote to my garden and maintaining every plant perfectly. I don't even have the most ideal growing conditions. My tomatoes get disease every year. You're going to see that. You can probably actually even see it now a little bit behind me. So I just wanted to kind of share with you more of, I'm sure there are plenty of amazing polished gardens out there on YouTube that you can find. But I just wanted to share with you a little bit more of, a regular person's garden. So I'm not, I've been gardening a while, but I'm not anything fancy. I don't do this full time or anything like that. So I just wanted to share with you how my tomatoes are going. Just a little bit of an update, what kind of harvests I've been getting from different varieties, how I've been feeling about different varieties as the season goes on. You'll also get to see which varieties tend to be a little more disease resistant or disease prone in my garden. And I think that honestly, looking back on this video will probably be really helpful for me too, especially in my specific growing conditions, to see how these tomatoes have done in my garden. So I did promise you guys this will be the unvarnished truth, and as you can see in front of you, I am delivering on that promise. So first of all, this variety right here is an unknown variety. This is a cherry tomato, which was supposed to be a Cherokee purple. It's some sort of red cherry tomato. If you've been following along with me this season, then you've heard that whole saga of my Cherokee purple tomatoes that just didn't end up being Cherokee purples. So I am not really all that thrilled with this red cherry tomato. The tomatoes taste fine. They were reasonably early. The yield was comparable to a lot of other cherry tomatoes that I have, so they were fine. But I certainly would not seek this type out to grow. As you can see, it is very disease prone. I will say that I have 2 of these plants, and they, I think, were the first tomatoes in my garden to start showing significant signs of disease. Now, that is the pitfall of growing primarily heirlooms. I have a few hybrids, but the majority of tomatoes in my garden are heirlooms. And while heirlooms reward you with delicious flavor, amazing variety, and just their uniqueness, there are some downsides to heirlooms as well. And one of them is that they tend to not be as disease resistant as many hybrids. For that reason, I did actually add a couple hybrids to my garden this year to kind of compare and see how they did. As I said, this tomato, I don't know what variety it is. I'm guessing it's an heirloom, just based on the fact that the nursery that I bought it from does specialize in heirlooms. While they do offer hybrids too, they offer many heirloom varieties, and the fact that it, has succumbed to disease so early on. So honestly, even though this tomato would yield more for me, I think I'm probably actually going to end up pulling it out. Now over here, I have a couple hybrid varieties. It's a little hard to distinguish one plant from another in this jungle, I know. In the back there, I have the Chef's Choice Black. You can see some of these tomatoes are starting to ripen. We have had a significant amount of rain, not even in rainfall amount, just in rain frequency. And well, honestly, I think that is part of the reason why a lot of these tomato plants are showing such severe signs of disease. But I also came out here and harvested as many tomatoes as I could, all the tomatoes that were ripe or close to ripe. When you're growing tomatoes and there is a significant rainfall, or even if there's really any rainfall predicted, it's a good idea to go ahead and harvest tomatoes that are either ripe or very close to ripe before that rain, because the most obvious issue is that when there's a significant amount of rain, tomatoes that are almost ripe, their skins tend to thin out a little bit. They'll take up a lot of water from that rainfall, and then that's when you get really severe cracking and splitting. So if you can harvest them before that rainfall, that's ideal. Now, I know everyone's going to have a different opinion on this. There's different opinions, and a lot of people have very strong opinions on this as to the ideal time to harvest tomatoes. It is true that when you harvest a tomato, when it's blushing, you can see these tomatoes here, they are starting to blush. They're changing from green, and they're starting to show signs of their final color. If you harvest a tomato at that point, it will continue ripening on your counter, and it will turn to its full color. There's a lot of different opinions about whether or not that is the right approach. My personal approach is to leave the tomatoes on the plant as long as possible. I find in my personal experience, I get the best flavor that way. But that being said, I will harvest them slightly underripe if I either have pest issues or if there is a rain predicted. So there were some other Chef's Choice black tomatoes that I harvested and brought inside on the counter. One other thing I want to note specifically about Chef's Choice black, and I think it's kind of true of most black tomatoes in general, is I've noticed that the shelf life tends to not be as long once you bring them inside. So that is one reason when it comes to black tomatoes, I tend to prefer to leave them on the plant as long as possible. I find that once they come into the house, they tend to spoil fairly quickly. So I find that by leaving them on the plant until I'm about ready to use them, that's ideal, and I do that if I can. So next I have the Chef's Choice orange. You can see I've got one there that's just about ready to harvest. There's some more clusters of green fruit that aren't ready but will be ready soon. I actually harvested the first tomato, I think yesterday, of this variety and have not tried it yet. Both of the Chef's Choice tomatoes are new varieties that I haven't grown before. So I have enjoyed the Chef's Choice Black. I find that it doesn't probably have quite the same richness as a lot of heirloom dark tomatoes, like, for example, my beloved Cherokee Purple. It doesn't quite measure up to that, but it does have a really good flavor. The Chef's Choice Orange I have not tried yet. I am thinking about making some bruschetta this afternoon with it, so I'll report back about how good that was. So going around the corner here, this tomato plant is a Russian Big Roma. So these are Roma tomatoes, but you can see these are significantly larger than regular Romas. I know it's a little bit hard to see in here. I'm trying to get an angle so you can actually see how big that tomato is. And then this one has been damaged by something. That's unfortunate. I might let that ripen and see. Hopefully it doesn't rot and I can cut this part out. We'll see what happens. So I have harvested several of the Russian Big Romas already. I've really enjoyed them. I find that, their flavor isn't anything amazing. A lot of Roma tomatoes don't necessarily have that same richness of flavor that the big slicing tomatoes have because they're bred specifically for preservation purposes, for making sauce and salsa and things like that. They're bred to have a lower water content. So I've definitely found that to be true of the Russian Big Roma. The flavor, it was fine, but it's not really meant to be eaten fresh. It's meant to be, as I said, cooked down into sauce or salsa. So I did actually make a nice batch of salsa yesterday using primarily the Russian Big Romas and canned that. So I am really excited about that. They worked really well for that application. I do appreciate, when it comes to sauce tomatoes, I appreciate a big tomato. Because when you have larger tomatoes like this, it's less work to remove the skins and the seeds because you need fewer tomatoes to get the same amount of product. So I do really appreciate that. One thing I will mention about the Russian Big Roma that is a little bit different than other Roma tomatoes is that this is an indeterminate plant. Basically what that means is that it's going to yield its tomatoes kind of the way most slicers do, a little bit here and there over a long season. Most Roma tomatoes will yield their tomatoes pretty much all at once in one big crop, which can be useful if you're looking for a big preservation day. It's a little bit easier to have all your tomatoes at once rather than coming in here and there. So that is one difference, just something. It's not really a negative or a positive. It's just something to be aware of. It could be either a negative or a positive depending on your specific situation. So we are going to make our way through this crazy jungle over here because I have a few more tomatoes here, which are wild and crazy and growing with abandon. Back here, I have a black from Tula tomato. You can see that, it does have some disease. This is an heirloom and it's fairly late in the season. We've had a wet season, so that's to be expected. So I will say, I don't know if you can see, there's more tomatoes back there. This is all from the same plant. I haven't harvested any of these black from Tula tomatoes yet, but I'm really looking forward to trying them. So, I have high expectations. Hopefully they live up to them. So through here, I have a Roma tomato. This is a regular Roma. So you can see the size difference between these tomatoes and the Russian big Romas that we looked at before. This plant, again, has some pretty significant signs of disease. You can see that I did stake it, but it just got too large and has decided to fall over into the walkway instead. So that Roma is, a sauce tomato. So that's something that I will be using to make sauce, maybe salsa. I may end up making some roasted tomato soup and freezing that. So when all those tomatoes, you can see they're starting to ripen. When those come in, we will do some preservation with those. I have a handful of other Romas throughout the garden as well. So hopefully they all provide their harvest to me at around the same time. So here you can see I have a couple tomato plants in pots. And you may notice that these are not showing the same signs of disease as the tomatoes in the ground in the garden. These tomato plants I started later in the season as suckers. I pulled some suckers off of my established tomato plants, rooted them, and stuck them in these pots here. Now you can see these are just starting to get their green tomatoes. The idea with these tomatoes is to extend the tomato harvest season without having to go through all the work of starting seeds from scratch. So these tomatoes, I have one that is Ukrainian purple and one that is a Wisconsin 55. And these, as you can see, they're younger plants, healthier plants. They don't have any sign of disease yet, despite the fact that disease is in the air. My experience with tomatoes in general is that as the season goes on, they will eventually get stressed and then they will succumb to disease. It's usually around the time when they start putting all their energy into ripening their fruit. These tomatoes, they're just starting to set fruit, but they're really still in the growing stages, so they have lots of energy to put towards maintaining their health. I imagine that at some point in the season, these will start to succumb to disease, but hopefully not before, helping me extend my tomato harvest season a little bit longer. So in this bed here, you can see my tomatoes are not very well behaved this year. That is a common theme through the garden. So this is another Roma tomato here. I think this one is actually, let's see. This is actually 10 Fingers of Naples. So this is a Roma variety, but it's a different variety than the Roma that we looked at over there. So you can see that I also, in this cage here, this tomato has obviously overpowered the cage. One reason I don't necessarily recommend tomato cages for large slicer tomatoes. This is a Dr. Weish's tomato. This is the Roma. So when the tomatoes become really unruly like this and start to take over and have a mind of their own, it's a little bit difficult to separate the plants from each other and differentiate them. But I do have the 10 Fingers of Naples. I also have a Dr. Weish's, which has not yielded any tomato fruits for me yet. It's a little bit of a later yielding plant anyway, but that one also got off to a little bit of a late start. So again, it can be when you're choosing tomato plants, it can be really tempting to go for all the really early maturing tomato varieties because, in the spring, you're just anxious for that first ripe tomato. You can't wait for it. But it's really actually, I find beneficial to choose plants with a variety of maturity dates. I mean, for fresh eating, for preservation, it is beneficial to get them all at once. But for fresh eating, I find that choosing plants with a variety of maturity dates just really extends my tomato harvest because, I don't need dozens of slicer tomatoes coming in all at once when I can't really use them. I would rather have, a few a day stretched out over a really long period of time. And by choosing some plants that mature later, that's what I get. So back here, there's another Roma. You can see this one is a little bit behind the one in the front. Oh, that one is really extending out. These plants back here do not get that much light, so they are not thriving as much as some of the others. But I still think I'm going to get a decent harvest from that. So that's what my tomato garden in this garden expansion looks like. We're going to head over to the main garden and see how the tomatoes over there are doing. Ultimately, we're going to also head up to my deck where I have a lot of tomatoes growing in pots. So let's head on over to the main garden and see how those tomatoes are doing. So we're going to start outside the garden over by the cherry tomato patch. So first over here I have red centiflora. This one has been yielding really well, doing really well for me. And over here I have Barry's Crazy Cherry. This one has gotten off to a little bit of a later start this year, but also it's still been doing really well. Both of those cherry tomato varieties, the red centiflora and the Berry's Crazy Cherry, are both multiflora varieties, which basically means that they produce really large clusters of flowers, which in turn, assuming that they get well pollinated, turn into really large clusters of fruit. Both of those have a good flavor. Neither of them are my favorite flavor for cherry tomatoes, but they're both really good, and because they're both so high yielding, I really enjoy growing both of those. So let's walk around through the garden to see the other side of the cherry tomato patch. So here you can see my Matt's Wild cherry tomato. This one is doing really well. It's kind of sprawling a little bit crazily. Back here, these are also Matt's Wild cherry. And I find that these have a great flavor. So right over here, you'll see all three of my favorite cherry tomato varieties, my must grows. That's Matt's Wild cherry, the red one that we just looked at. Sun Gold, which is kind of a medium-sized orange. We'll look at that in a minute. And Black Cherry, which is a larger dark purple tomato variety. Between everybody in my family, that covers, each of us has one of those chosen as a favorite cherry tomato. They're all delicious, all really high yielding, all very dependable. We really enjoy those. So here you can see the Black Cherry. These, and back here there's some more of those ripening. That's a little bit of a later ripening tomato, but it's definitely worth waiting for. And the Sun Gold. We have, you can see it's got a lot of green tomatoes that still need to ripen. We've been really happy with those. Back here, these huge cherry tomatoes. This is a new variety to me called Hartman's Yellow Gooseberry. I got this in a sampler pack and we've been liking it. It's a little bit large for my taste, honestly, but it has good flavor. Then over here, I have Rosella, which this doesn't have very many ripe tomatoes at the moment either. This is kind of, it reminds me a little bit of Black Cherry. It's that same purple color, similar flavor, but a little bit smaller. So in case you couldn't tell from this little patch here, I really enjoy having a big variety of cherry tomatoes. I like to make sure that I have them in every color and every flavor. They're just so delicious. At the end of the season, I am planning to do a full tomato review video where I'm going to talk about all of the varieties, or at least most of the varieties, that I grew this year. And at that point, the season will be over and I'll be able to give a thorough rundown of all the varieties. But for right now, I just wanted to give a little bit of an in-progress update. I do have some slicing tomatoes growing over here too, so let's take a look at those next. I will say the slicing tomatoes in this area of my garden have not been doing all that well this year. So the combination of really high disease pressure, and actually this year I've had fairly high pest pressure as well. The combination of those for some reason has been affecting this area of the garden particularly hard. And while I still have been getting, I've still been harvesting tomatoes, I've still been having plenty of tomatoes for fresh eating, they're not doing as well as they have in some past years, but I still want to show you how they're doing. But you can see something's been eating them, and then they're filled with fruit flies. So really none of these tomatoes are usable, even though those should be perfectly delicious tomatoes. This is Cindy's West Virginia, which is one of my favorite varieties. But since I don't know what's causing this damage, I'm not really sure how to prevent it. So you can see my garden is fenced. So admittedly, this fence is not high enough to reliably keep out deer. They could easily jump this fence, but I don't think that it is deer because I haven't had any issues with any of my foliage or vegetation or anything being eaten. So I'm wondering if it's maybe squirrels or chipmunks or something along those lines. I'm not really sure. Something that is able to climb the fence. I'm going to have to just be vigilant and try to catch whatever it is in the act. If it is squirrels, I don't really know how to prevent them because, they can climb the fence. If you have any suggestions for that, I'm not willing to spray anything toxic on my actual tomato plants. So if you have any other suggestions, I would love to hear them. Next, I have these Lemon Boy Plus tomatoes. This has just started yielding. I've harvested a handful of these yellow globe tomatoes so far, and we've been happy with them. This is one of the hybrids that I'm trying this year. You can see there's more that aren't quite ripe yet. Through here, a lot of these large tomatoes belong to my pink oxheart, which is a super reliable, delicious tomato. And back there, we're going to go around the corner and take a closer look, but you can see some black brandywine tomatoes. So we're going to try to, this one you can see is a little bit gnarly. This was probably from a fasciated blossom, and so it's basically multiple tomatoes fused together. Last year, I tried growing the black brandywine for the first time, and it really did not do well. But I had a similar problem with all of the dark tomatoes in my garden, even ones that had been reliable for me for many years in the past. So I decided to grow the black brandywine again this year, and we have gotten a few tomatoes from it. They've had really good flavor. I won't say that the yield has been amazing, but it was still worth growing. So I'm going to, as I said, just keep paying attention to what kind of yield we get as the season goes on and update you guys again at the end of the season. So on that back trellis wall back there, I did grow a variety of tomato plants. You can see there's a few tomato fruits here and there, but I think they've been really choked out by that crazy pumpkin that has tried to take over the world. So when I planted that pumpkin, I knew it was going to sprawl. I did not know it was going to sprawl quite so much and be quite such an aggressive spreader. So the tomatoes back there, as I said, they've been smothered by the pumpkin. I've been harvesting a few tomatoes here and there, but I don't anticipate a really significant harvest from them through no fault of their own. I mean, they've just been crowded out. Some more Lemon Boy Plus tomatoes. I'm thinking that this tomato is probably going to be a winner in my book. Now over here, look at this tomato disease. You can see this is very spotty. There are some tomato fruits in there. You can see a few here and there, kind of hard to see through the leaves. Back there's a few. So those are my Defiant tomatoes, which was a highly recommended hybrid. It's supposed to be a medium-sized red tomato. It's supposed to be very reliable and high yielding. So my main point in growing hybrids was to try to avoid this tomato disease. So just the fact that it's gotten a disease doesn't automatically disqualify it. I have to see how it handles the disease. If it's able to keep growing and producing good fruit, despite the fact that it has that sickness, then it can still become a winner in my book. We haven't actually gotten any yield from this tomato yet. We haven't gotten any ripe fruits. So I'm going to withhold judgment on that. I'll definitely fill you in on that at the end of the season. One thing I will say is that I see poop here, which means that I likely have a tomato hornworm somewhere in this foliage. So I'm going to have to come out and look for that. I don't usually get tomato hornworms. They're definitely around here, but I don't usually have a significant issue with them. I have found quite a few this year, though. I've probably already disposed of, I don't know, maybe a dozen or so on my plants. So apparently I didn't get all of them. I'm going to have to come out here and look a little more thoroughly and try to find the rest of those. Here you can see some persimmon tomatoes. This is a new variety that I also got in basically a grab bag, so I decided to give it a try. It's got some more tomatoes here. So I haven't harvested any of these yet, but I'm hopeful that they'll be good, so I'll keep you updated on that. So I will say that even though I get enough tomatoes for my needs, enough tomatoes that I'm happy with, I do think that they would yield quite a bit more if my garden got a little more sun. We get basically the bare minimum amount of sun to be considered full sun. It's actually probably slightly less than that, but it's close enough that, I'm able to still get a significant yield. So while I realize that this garden's yield is going to be nothing compared to many gardens that you see on YouTube that are growing with ideal conditions with people who devote a lot more time to their garden than I do, I just wanted to share with you guys how these tomatoes are doing. The only tomato plants that we have not taken a look at yet are the ones growing in pots on my deck. So we can head over there and take a look at those. My deck this year has been, I want to say both more successful and less successful than the plants in the garden, because I planted plants on the deck. Normally I plant plants in pots on my deck and they do okay. They do enough that they're worth growing, but usually it's the plants in the garden that outperform them. This year the plants in pots on my deck have grown out of control and crazy. So, while that on one hand is a good thing because it leads to a lot more yield, on the other hand, it's also a negative thing because it leads to significantly reduced airflow and faster spread of disease. So I spaced the plants the way that I would normally have to space them if they grew to the size they normally get in a typical year in pots on my deck. This year they did not get to that size. They far exceeded that size, which means that my deck is kind of almost unnavigable, which is kind of fun in a way. I do like having, a big jungle up on the deck. But at the same time, I am finding that I'm getting more disease on the deck than normal. So let's just go take a look and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So as we head up to the deck, you can see what I'm talking about. I mean, it's pretty much unmanageable. So over here, I have a really large pot that has 3 cherry tomatoes in it, which I just allowed them to sprawl in different directions. So you can see I've got a red centiflora here. You can see a lot of tomatoes down there. You can also see more disease up here than you could probably see in the garden, in the cherry tomato patch. So down here, this is a Berry's Crazy Cherry. You can see the tomatoes are a little bit pointier, a little bit longer. We haven't had any yield from this plant yet, but we will soon. And in this pot, I also have a black cherry. I don't think I could tell you exactly which parts belong to that. Actually, probably this here. So we'll see. We'll see what happens as these grow. Thorburns terracotta, which I have mixed feelings about this tomato variety this year. This is my first year growing this tomato variety. I wanted to grow it because I've heard great things about it, because it's very unique. It's a really different color than any other tomatoes that I've ever grown. And I will say a lot of you chimed in and said that it has great flavor, but that the yield wasn't necessarily the best. And when this plant first started producing tomatoes, I've got to say I doubted some of you guys because it was producing so many tomatoes. I was like, wow, this is having a great yield. But then what I found happened was so many of these fruits got blossom end rot. Now, blossom end rot can be an environmental issue. It's basically a calcium deficiency within your tomatoes, which doesn't necessarily, it can be caused by a calcium deficiency in the soil, but more often than that, it's caused by uneven watering, because uneven watering prevents the plant from taking up calcium, being able to access the calcium in the soil. So that's not something that you can always completely blame on the plant. Sometimes there's just certain seasons that produce a lot of blossom end rot in tomatoes. But the thing is that I'm comparing it to other varieties in my garden, other varieties on this deck that are also dealing with the same conditions, and those plants have been fine. I think off of this plant here, I mean, you can see it has lots of tomatoes on it. Some of them are very rotten from blossom end rot that has spread throughout the tomato. I just haven't been fast enough picking the fruits off. I will say that I think I've harvested maybe 2 tomatoes off of this plant, and the rest I've just had to pull off and throw in the woods. You know, they start off looking like this, like a perfectly normal fruit, and then so that's very advanced. Normally I pull them off before they get to that point, but they'll develop this, like look at this one up here. Black spot on the bottom. This one is fairly advanced too. And this is not going to go away as it ripens. It's just going to get worse. So the thing to do is pull all those fruits off and then hope that the next flush is better. So this one, I don't know, this may develop normally. I'm not really sure yet. We'll have to wait and see. Now over here, you can see both many tomatoes and abundant disease. All these little red tomatoes are my Wisconsin 55, which I do really love this tomato variety. So I feel like I need to apologize again for my voice. At the beginning of this video, I thought, oh, it's not that bad. We'll be able to make it through. I think as I'm talking, my voice is getting a little bit worse. So for those of you who have stuck it out and stayed with me, thank you so much. I know that it's not always the most enjoyable to listen to a scratchy voice the way mine is today, but I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me in the garden anyway. So back to the Wisconsin 55. I find that this tomato is really prolific. It yields a lot of tomatoes for me. It yields really early. The tomatoes are delicious. So for that reason, I really love it. I am finding, though, I think it's a little bit more disease prone, at least in my area, than a lot of the other tomatoes that I've been growing in my garden. Now, that being said, I mean, look at the yield that it's managed to produce before succumbing to disease. So I still think it's worth growing. But, you know, that kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Have some varieties like that produce really early, really prolifically in the beginning of the season, but then also have some varieties that take longer to ripen, because that is going to allow you to have the longest possible tomato season. Through here, you can see my very first Ukrainian purples are ripening. You can see we had some cracking, probably due to the excessive rain this week. So I haven't tried any of these yet. There are quite a few. You can see there's another, I don't know if you can really see them, there's another clump down there. And, you know, there's a variety of these throughout here. I have been really excited to try them, but I have not yet. Here you can see my Sun Gold cherry tomato. So I think next year, as much as I love this crazy wild garden on the deck, I think I am going to have to, I probably won't cut down the amount of plants that I'm growing, but I probably will spread them out. I think I may put some on the lower deck, and I may put some over in the garden, some of these pots, so that it isn't quite such a sprawling mess on the deck. That being said, I mean, it is pretty cool, so I'm going to enjoy it while I have it this year. I've got lots of Sun Gold tomatoes. Those are really prolific and reliable, and those are all over. And back there, if you can see through there, I do have a pink Oxheart tomato. This has yielded quite a few tomatoes for us. I've been really happy with that plant grown on the deck. So thank you so much for hanging out with me in the garden today. I guess this was kind of a mini garden tour just focused on the tomato plants. Now, as you can see, my garden's not perfect. I'm not a perfect gardener. We have disease, we have problems with the tomatoes. That being said, we're still getting so many delicious tomatoes. I've had such a good yield. I've been able to make roasted salsa. I canned a batch of salsa. We've been able to make bruschetta and just eat as many tomatoes as we want fresh. It's just been really delicious. I love fresh garden tomatoes in the summer, and as you can see, I love to have a variety of tomatoes. So, despite the issues this year, no gardening season is ever going to be perfect. Despite those issues, I'm really happy with how my tomatoes are doing this year. And as I did mention, at the end of the season, I'll be giving a full tomato review where we'll be talking about all the different varieties, comparing them, and I find that really interesting to refer back to when I'm choosing varieties to grow again in the future. So I hope that you will come back and look for that video. Probably September, October, sometime around there, I'll be posting that. In the meantime, I can't wait to see you again. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.